All right, so welcome back. Today's notes are going to be on absolutism. This is page 5 for your packet. As you remember from your reading, absolutism is when a ruler has absolute control over everything in daily life. Everything in the country is under control of a monarch. That is absolutism. So these notes are going to be on page 5. Make sure you pause what you need to in order to fill in the notes. But it's also going to be important that you pay attention and you listen as we go. So here we go. Absolutism. So what is absolutism? So as we said already, absolutism is having complete power to do whatever you want and force others to do what you want without limits. You can do anything you want. You have control of every aspect of a country, what religion people practice, what the military does, what can be bought, what can be sold, where people can meet, what you can write down in books and newspapers. Absolutism means the king or queen has complete control over all of that. This fancy guy over here to the right, his name is King Philip II of Spain, meaning he's the second king of Spain named Philip. This is an example of an absolute monarch. They all wanted to be like him. And if you notice, look how he's dressed, right? So he's dressed in this fancy armor. This was the kings and queens, you remember from your reading, always tried to look more powerful than they actually were, right? So they'd wear fancy armor, fancy clothing, make it look like they had a lot of money. Basically, they were fronting a lot of the time. They were trying to make it seem like they had more power than they did in order to stop people from trying to challenge them. So now, in order to be have absolute power, you had to stop people from challenging that authority. And so you would dress and act like you actually were more powerful than you were to stop people from challenging that power. Think back what Machiavelli would have told people to do from the Renaissance readings. So what gives monarchs the right to be absolute monarchs? Because, right, if I told you I have complete control of everything you do, and I have the right to tell you what you can wear, what you can say, what you can think, what you can write, what games you can play, your first thing you're going to ask is, well, what gives you the right? How come you get to tell me what to do, Dunbeck? Well, I, as an absolute monarch, would claim that this power didn't come from me. It's coming from God. Because remember, at this time, the Renaissance challenged the Catholic Church's power, but people weren't becoming atheists. They're still very religious, right? So the monarchs were taking advantage of the fact that their subjects were still extremely religious, but now they're no longer looking to the church because, remember, with the Reformation, the Crusades, the Plague, people weren't trusting the Catholic Church as much anymore. And so, but they were still very religious, still believed in Jesus and all that. And so this is the idea of called the divine right of kings, meaning God made me king. So you're a Christian, that's great. The Christian God said, I get to be king, and if you challenge me, you're challenging God. And so that's kind of a way the kings use people's religious faith against them. And you see this over and over again in history. You have rulers claiming that they're on a mission from God, and that's why you should let them do whatever they want. It's a very dangerous precedent, but it keeps happening over and over in history. You even see in America some people, some political leaders claiming that they have a right to be in charge or they're on a mission from God. And this is just a way of taking advantage of people's faith. Right? The result of this is that monarchs claim that they only had to listen to God and no one else. So if you came to me and I was an absolute monarch and you said that, I can't do something or that I'm wrong, well, I would respond, the only one I have to listen to is God, not you, not the Pope, no one else. This is what's meant by absolute monarchs. There's only one entity in the universe that can stop me, and that's God. So that's the divine right of kings. What caused absolute monarchies to rise? Well, as you learned again from your reading, there are three main causes that led to of the rise of absolutism or absolute monarchs. Remember, a monarch is a king or a queen. First off, you got to remember, for the last several hundred years, Europe had been basically dominated by religious and territorial conflicts, creating fear and uncertainty. So there was the 100 Years' War, which lasted 100 years, the 30 Years' War, which lasted 30 years. Before that, there were the Crusades, then there were, the Black Death, the Reformation, constant raids by Vikings, Magyars, Muslims. So Europe was constantly in this period of worry and fear of attack and unrest. Peasant unvolts were happening all the time. Think about the Reformation, right? The peasants were rising up and challenging people. So there's this fear of things not being safe. And as a result of this uncertainty, kings and queens had to hire more soldiers to keep everything under control and keep things peaceful. Well, those soldiers aren't going to work for free. They had to be paid. The result of this was that kings had to raise taxes on people with money who didn't want to pay it, so the taxes then got passed on to the lower classes, the peasants, who then revolted, which then meant we needed more soldiers to keep the peasants under control, which meant we needed more taxes to pay for more soldiers. And all this resulted in basically kings and queens taking power and basically saying all the power is in their hands now. We see the same thing happening today, really. Right, so we have the need for peace and security, so we need taxes to pay for police and things like that. Well, the rich don't want to pay it, and so it gets passed down to the middle class, which gets squeezed tighter and tighter, and they don't want to pay it, and so then all of a sudden it's the lower classes who wind up having to pay for everything in society. So what are the consequences of this? The consequences was that rulers regulated religious worship and social gathering to control the spread of ideas. Remember what brought down the Catholic Church? This was brought down by people sharing ideas and explaining why the Catholic Church was wrong. And wherever the Renaissance, using science to prove things the church was talking about wrong. And so kings and queens, they decided in order to stop people from challenging them and saying that they're wrong, kings and queens had to instead control what people thought and what they said. In order to control that, they had to control where and how people would gather and meet. And this was all to stop the spread of ideas that could be a challenge to their absolute control over everything in life. They also increased the size of their courts to appear more powerful. Now, you hear the word court today, and you probably think of judges, juries, lawyers, things like that. That comes from the fact that kings and queens, they had the complete power to write laws, enforce laws, and then judge if people broke the laws, right? So if you broke the laws, you had to go to court. What is the court? The court is where the king and his basically closest advisors were. So that's where we get the term court from. And to make themselves seem more powerful, they would create bigger and bigger and wealthier and more magnificent courts in order to make it look like they had more power than they did, so people wouldn't challenge them. In order to control more of the economy, they had to create bureaucracies, right? So a bureaucracy is basically the people who work for the government who do the day-to-day work of the government. So, for instance, the federal government in America, right, our national total, government, and the state of Wisconsin's government have laws explaining that all kids have to be in school until the age of 18, with some exceptions. Well, the president of the United States and the governor of Wisconsin aren't going to be enforcing that law. They're not going to be making sure the kids are in school. They're not going to be doing the teaching themselves. So instead, they hire bureaucrats like myself, teachers, to do the teaching to make sure you get the learning done. So I am part of the bureaucracy, basically a member of the government who is hired to do the day-to-day work of the government. And that's what monarchs did. They created bureaucracies to help carry out the day-to-day work of making the country run. So what led to the growing power of monarchs in Europe? First off, feudalism. Remember that M&M game we played that might give you kind of a hint of what our reminder what feudalism is? You got the peasants at the bottom, followed by the knights who collected taxes, who then gave the taxes to the nobles, who then owed to the king. But if the nobles gathered together, they had more power than the king. Well, the feudal system and the power of the nobles started to weaken thanks to the Crusades, the Black Plague, things like this. And so as feudalism died off, there was a power vacuum, and the king stepped in and grabbed more and more of the nobles' power for themselves. Then there was also the growth of cities and the rise of national kingdoms helped bring power into one person's, specifically the monarch's, hands. So as people moved into cities, people were closer together, easier to control them. And then the rise of national kingdoms, right? Remember, a nation is different from a government. So the terms we use commonly are nation, country, and state. A nation is a group of people who share a common history, culture, and language. A state is a government, and a country is the land, the territory itself. So a nation state is a government controlled by a nation, a group of people who share common language, history, and culture. A good way of thinking about this is look at the United Kingdom. Here in the United Kingdom, it's made out of 4 nations. Four countries: Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England, right? The countries, the land, are called Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England. The nation, the group of people who share common language, culture, and history, the Scottish have their own language, culture, and history. The Irish have their own, the Welsh have their own, and the English have their own. So it's 4 separate nations, 4 separate countries that are united under one state, the state of the United Kingdom. All right. What else led to it? Well, growing economy built a strong middle class that supports monarchs because monarchs promise stability, which is good for business. What does this mean? So we hear the term middle class a lot. In the economy, there's generally people are stratified into 3 groups. The lower class, who basically do a lot of work and they spend pretty much all their money on basic survival, food, water, shelter. The upper class at the very top up here, who make a lot of money, and so when you add up all their money, they spend a very little of it on food, shelter, and basic survival needs, and they have way more money than they need, and so they're able to buy a lot of comforts. The middle class have enough money through work in order to meet their survival needs, but at the same time are able to purchase some comforts in life. So, for instance, I would be considered middle class because I have enough money to pay for food, housing, things like that. But I also have extra spending money without having to go into debt to buy things like a fishing boat and basic daily luxuries without so I can enjoy a little bit more of life. That's what the middle class is. And the king basically promised to keep things stable. And when things are stable, people buy things more, which meant the merchants in the middle class were able to gain more wealth. So the middle class threw their support behind the king. Next up, the Reformation, plague, crusades, and all that we've been talking about weakened the power of the church. And as the church's power fell and feudalism fell, there's this, again, this power vacuum. Who's going to step in and take control of the people? Well, in this case, the monarchs, the kings and queens, stepped in to grab that power away from the church when people were turning away from it. So let's sum this up. So Europe had faced near constant war and results. This led to monarchs grabbing more power in order to stop conflicts. So in essence, the people traded their freedom for security and safety, right? So I will give you all my freedom if you promise to keep me safe. That was the deal people were making with monarchs. And what was given up? Well, absolute monarchs controlled everything in their nation states. Remember, a nation state is a group of people with common shared culture and history that control a state, a government. So they control pretty much everything, right? Religion, military, economy, when and where people can meet and gather, and what could even be said. So, for instance, remember the Reformation in England. The King of England broke away from the Catholic Church and then created his own Christian church, the Anglican Church, which the king was going to be in charge of. So the King of England was in charge of all of Christianity and how to be a good Christian in England. He was in charge of the military, so he controlled all the soldiers, what could be bought, what could be sold. He was in charge of all that. He even controlled where and when people can meet and talk and what could be discussed. At the same time, he also controlled what could be printed in newspapers, right? It was this idea of keeping control of what people could think and do in order to stop people from challenging their, phenomenal cosmic powers. So this is the idea of absolutism. You have absolute power over all aspects of life within your state. All right, that's all we got for today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you need to rewatch this, feel free.